The wind off the San Juans came down mean that October, stripping the cottonwoods bare before they'd had a proper chance to yellow. Elias Cord stood at the gate of the Beaumont homestead with $43 in his coat pocket and a silence around him that most men took for coldness. It wasn't coldness. He'd been carrying something heavier than cold for 11 years. The Beaumont place sat low against a red clay hillside, the kind of house that had given up arguing with the weather a long time ago. One shutter hanging crooked. A porch board split down the middle. 3 goats penned in what had once been a decent corral, now listing eastward like a man who'd had too much whiskey and not enough sense. Gerald Beaumont stood in the doorway with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, doing the arithmetic on Elias's coat. Good wool. Thick cut, the way poor men always did when better-dressed men came calling. Behind Gerald, in the grey shadow of the doorframe, stood a young woman of 24. She had her mother's eyes. Dark as creek water in November. She had her own jaw though, set firm against something she hadn't yet named. Her name was June. Elias had last seen her when she was 13 years old, standing in a church doorway in Cimarron, New Mexico, holding a hymnal to her chest like it was the only armor she owned. He'd been 22 then, riding through on borrowed time, and he'd thought, that girl is going to have a hard life if nobody decent finds her first. He hadn't been able to forget the thought. Not once. Not in 11 years. He took his hat off now, which surprised Gerald Beaumont considerably. I understand, Elias said, plain as weather, that you're in a situation. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. The arrangement was not romantic, and Elias did not pretend that it was. Gerald Beaumont owed 3 seasons of debt to the Colfax Merchant Bank and a separate, uglier debt to a man named Rudd Hardcastle who operated out of Taos and dealt in the kind of loans that came with conditions attached, conditions that had lately begun involving June's name in ways that made her mother weep into her apron at night and say nothing about it during the day. Elias had heard about it the way men who paid attention always heard about things, in pieces, from different sources, across too many miles to be coincidence. A word from the Cimarron postmaster. A letter half-read at a trading post. A name spoken over a fire outside of Rayadu by a man who thought he was only talking to himself. He'd ridden 4 days to get here. The $43 went to Gerald. The receipt was signed. The transaction was dressed up in language that called it a labor arrangement, a domestic partnership, a westward relocation of household. The frontier had always been creative with its paperwork. But June understood what it was. She stood in the doorway of her childhood home with 1 carpet bag and 2 children who were not her own but whom she'd been raising since her sister Clara died of fever 18 months ago. Clara's twins, a boy named August, age 6, and a girl named Wren, age 4. Elias loaded all 3 of them into the wagon without ceremony. June did not cry. She watched the red clay hillside until it curved out of sight, then she turned forward and looked at the road ahead with those dark November eyes, and she did not speak for 2 hours. Elias did not push her. He'd learned that the world pushed people plenty without any help. His property sat 12 miles south of the town of Harrow, Colorado. At the foot of a long granite ridge that the Ute people had called something that translated roughly as the place the wind comes to rest. Elias had bought it 6 years ago from a widow who'd lost her husband to a mining collapse and lost her will shortly after. He'd fixed the roof, rebuilt the fireplace from river stone, replaced 3 sets of window glass, and planted a kitchen garden that had since gone moderately feral with squash. When the wagon pulled into the yard that evening, the light was the color of hammered brass, low and lateral, striking the east face of the house and making it look almost golden. Almost worth something. June climbed down before Elias could offer his hand. She lifted Wren from the wagon bed with practiced efficiency, set the girl on her hip, and stood in the yard looking at the house with an expression he could not fully read. Not despair. Something more considered than despair. It needs work, she said. Yes, he said. The garden's gone to riot. Yes. She looked at him then, briefly, and looked away. Where do we sleep? He showed them the 2 back rooms, one for the children, already fitted with a narrow bed and a cornhusk mattress he'd put together 3 weeks ago when he'd made his decision. And one for June, which had his grandmother's quilt on it and a small mirror above the washstand. He slept in the front room, near the fire. She noticed, without comment, that he had already hung a new latch on her door. Heavy iron. The kind that could be thrown from the inside. The first meal was a long time coming, and it was the better for it. June found the kitchen in moderate chaos, sacks of cornmeal and dried beans stacked without order, a cast iron skillet cured black and good. A Dutch oven with a hairline crack that still held heat well enough, a string of dried chilies hanging from a nail above the window. She moved through the space the way a woman moves through a space she is already making her own, with economy and quiet authority, opening doors, assessing contents. Reorganizing without asking permission. Elias brought in firewood without being asked. He split it fine so it caught quickly, loaded the firebox, and then stood at a respectful distance while she worked, unsure what else to do with himself. August appeared at the kitchen doorway, watching June with the silent vigilance of a child who had learned early to read the temperature of a room. "Come here," June said, not looking up from the cornmeal she was measuring. "Wash your hands at the basin and start snapping those beans." August came. Wren came after him, dragging a ragged cloth rabbit by its remaining ear. The kitchen filled with the sound of small hands working and the crackle of the fire and the deep, almost ceremonial smell of rendered fat meeting a hot skillet. June made cornbread from the good meal and a scant pour of buttermilk she'd found stoppered in a crock. She found an onion and 2 wizened potatoes and coaxed them into something worthwhile with the dried chili and a piece of salt pork. She found a jar of peach preserves on the highest shelf. Elias had put them up himself that summer, the pit still working in his hands from a bad batch, and she set it on the table without comment. The table was plain pine, unfinished, the kind of table that had absorbed years of cups and elbows and had nothing left to prove. They sat down together, all 4 of them, for the first time. Elias reached for the bread and then stopped, because August had bowed his small head without prompting, and June had folded her hands, and Wren was watching him with enormous serious eyes. He bowed his head. The silence of grace sat over the table like something with weight to it, a presence rather than an absence. When it lifted, Wren reached for the peach preserves with both hands and June caught her wrist with the gentle reflexive certainty of 10,000 identical moments. "Ask," June said. "Please," Wren said, without missing a beat. June spread preserves on a piece of cornbread and handed it to her. Then she ate her own meal in small, careful bites, and she did not look at Elias, and he did not look at her. But somewhere inside the respectable radius of that table, something that had been cold began, almost imperceptibly, to consider the possibility of warmth. Elias ate 2 pieces of bread and a full bowl of the potato stew and said, "That's the best meal I've had in this kitchen." "That's not saying a great deal," June replied. But her mouth did something at the corner that was not quite a smile and not quite not one either. October moved through the valley the way an old man moves through a room, slowly, leaving things colder than he found them. Pausing sometimes in a doorway to consider whether it was worth going forward at all. The mornings arrived grey and edged with frost. June woke before the house, built the fire from coals she'd banked the night before with a precision that suggested she'd been doing it all her life. And had coffee on the stove before the light outside had made up its mind about what color it intended to be. Elias noticed this and said nothing. He simply began leaving the firewood box filled before he went to bed at night, so that she never had to go out in the dark for it. They moved around each other in those first 2 weeks with the careful choreography of people who understood that the distance between them was a kindness rather than a slight, that space, given freely, was its own form of respect. The children, however, had no use for careful choreography. August followed Elias to the barn on the 3rd morning, wordless, hands in the pockets of his coat. Elias handed him a brush without discussion and pointed at the roan mare who stood in the second stall chewing at her feed with aristocratic indifference. "Start at the shoulder," Elias said. "Move with her, not against." August brushed the horse for 40 minutes with a focus that was extraordinary for a 6-year-old. At the end of it, he looked up and said, "She's not scared of me." "No," Elias said. "She's reading you." Animals read honest things. "You're honest." August considered this with great seriousness. Then he nodded once, as if filing it under permanent memory, and went back to brushing. Wren was a different creature entirely. She arrived in whatever room she entered like weather, sudden and total. She had appointed the barn cat her personal responsibility, which the barn cat accepted with philosophical resignation. She brought June small objects of dubious value, a smooth river stone, a blue jay feather, a button she'd found in the yard of no discernible origin. June accepted each gift with the same gravity she'd have accorded a diamond, which delighted Wren and ensured a steady stream of future offerings. It was on a Tuesday, 11 days after their arrival, that something shifted between Elias and June. He found her in the kitchen garden at dusk, pulling dead squash vines off the fence with a kind of systematic fury that had more feeling in it than gardening strictly required. He came and pulled beside her without a word. They worked in the failing light, the vines coming away with that specific dry brittleness of things that had finally given up, and after a while June said, without looking at him, "Did my father tell you what Hardcastle wanted?" "He didn't have to," Elias said. She pulled a long section of vine free and dropped it on the pile. "And you just happened to ride for days to find us. I had information about your situation." "You sought that information?" He paused. "Yes." June was quiet for a moment, turning a withered squash over in her hands. "You knew my family in Cimarron." "I was 13. I remember a man who gave my brother a silver dollar for carrying his saddle to the livery." "Your brother's name was Thomas," Elias said. "He had red hair. He could whistle any tune you hummed to him." She looked at him then. Really looked, for the first time. "I thought about your family sometimes," Elias said carefully. "Whether things had gone well for you." He looked back at the garden. "I heard they hadn't." She did not answer. She dropped the withered squash on the pile and went inside. But the next morning, when Elias came downstairs, there was a cup of coffee already poured and sitting at his end of the table. He drank it without making note of the fact. 40 miles south of Harrow, in a flat-roofed adobe building outside of Taos that smelled of tobacco and dry rot and unresolved debts. Rudd Hardcastle sat at a card table and looked at the letter in his hand with the expression of a man who was deciding how much effort something was worth. Gerald Beaumont had sent the letter himself, either out of guilt or out of cowardice, trying to dress up as honesty. It explained the arrangement. Elias Cord. Property south of Harrow. The $43. Hardcastle set the letter down and looked at the man across from him, a flat-eyed rider named Dix who did Hardcastle's distance work. "Cord," Hardcastle said, as if trying the word for taste. "Mountain man. Keeps to himself." "I know the name," Dix said. "He's not a man to walk on easy." "No," Hardcastle agreed. "But I had an investment in that situation. An arrangement I'd been cultivating for some time." He folded the letter with precise, patient movements. "I don't like being cut out of an arrangement." Dix waited. "Ride up to Harrow," Hardcastle said. "Take your time. Get a feel for the territory. I want to know what we're dealing with before we decide what to do about it." Dix stood, settled his hat, and walked out into the Taos afternoon, which was the hard, dry, colorless kind that promised nothing. Harrow was the kind of small town that had organized itself around its own opinion of itself, which was high, and the opinions it held about everyone who lived within a 15-mile radius, which were extensive and not always charitable. The main street ran east to west and caught the morning light dead-on, which made it look picturesque in a way that its residents found validating. There was a mercantile, a livery, a post office, a church that doubled as a courthouse on Wednesdays, a saloon that everybody attended in one capacity or another, and a barbershop that served as the town's primary center of political analysis. Elias drove the wagon in on a Thursday with June beside him on the bench and the children in the back. And he was aware before he'd tied off the horse of the particular quality of silence that small towns produce when something worth watching has arrived. He helped June down from the wagon, offering his hand, which she took with neutral practicality, and they went about their separate business, June to the mercantile for flour, salt, thread, and the small necessities of a household being rebuilt from the ground up, Elias to the feed store for grain and to the post office to collect 3 weeks of held mail. He got as far as the post office steps before Harlan Greaves materialized beside him. Greaves was the county recorder, a position of modest actual authority that he had expanded through force of personality and the strategic deployment of moral opinion into something considerably more powerful. He was 61, clean-shaved, and had the manner of a man who believed that the universe had organized itself for his benefit and was consequently personally offended by all evidence to the contrary. "Cord," Greaves said. "Been hearing things." "Expect you have," Elias said, taking his mail from the postmaster through the window without looking at Greaves. "A woman and 2 children," Greaves said. "At your property?" "That's accurate." "Unrelated to you?" "Unmarried." Greaves let that sit for a moment the way men like Greaves let things sit, watching to see what it disturbed. "People are talking." Elias sorted through his mail with attention to detail that he did not actually feel. "People talk," he said. "There are certain standards in this county, Greaves." Elias looked at him directly. "Those children lost their mother. That woman has kept them alive and fed and decent. She is employed on my property in a legal arrangement recorded with the state. She has her own room with a lock on it. I have mine." He tucked his mail inside his coat. "Your standards are intact." Greaves worked his mouth for a moment. "Employed," he repeated. "As what, exactly?" "Housekeeper." "Cook." "Manager of the domestic operation." Elias settled his hat. "I work outside." "She works inside." "Arrangements of that nature are not unusual." "Arrangements of that nature," Greaves said with emphasis, "generally involve a woman with no other options and a man who's decided to exploit that fact." Elias was still for a moment. The main street of Harrow continued around them, a wagon rolling past, 2 women in bonnets conducting a conversation on the mercantile porch, a dog conducting its own slow investigation of the hitching post. "You think carefully," Elias said at last, quietly, "about what you say next and where you say it." The quality of the quiet around that sentence was enough to make Greaves take a half step back that he would spend the rest of the afternoon pretending he hadn't taken. Inside the mercantile, June was having her own version of the morning. The proprietor was a Mrs. Adela Fitch, a sensible woman, basically, but sensible in the specifically local way that required the opinions of others to remain sensible at all. She measured out June's flour with a friendliness that had been calibrated to reveal information rather than offer it. "You're settled in well, then, Mrs. Fitch said, pouring salt into a paper cone with practiced efficiency. "Out at the Cord place." "We're settled," June said. "He's a quiet man. Keeps himself apart." "Mrs. Fitch leaned slightly on the counter, which was her version of leaning in. "People weren't sure what to make of it when we heard. A man alone on that property for 6 years and then all of a sudden," she let the sentence suggest its own ending. "Then all of a sudden the house has a cook and the garden has been turned," June said pleasantly, "and there are fewer ways for a man to die slowly of his own self-sufficiency." Mrs. Fitch blinked. "I appreciate the community's concern," June continued, lifting her basket to the counter with the items she'd selected. "The children appreciate it too. They haven't had much stability. It's good to know there are people nearby who take an interest." It was masterfully done. Mrs. Fitch found herself nodding before she decided to nod, suddenly rearranged from interrogator into concerned neighbor, from judge into witness. June paid in coin. Elias had given her a household allowance that morning, setting the money on the kitchen table between them with the same matter-of-fact directness with which he did everything, and collected her goods and went out. She nearly walked into Elias on the porch. He looked at her. She looked at him. "How was the post office?" she asked. "Instructive," he said. "The mercantile was illuminating as well," she said. He held her basket while she descended the steps and gave it back when they reached level ground. They walked to the wagon side by side without discussing any of it further, which was, in its own way, a more complete conversation than most people managed with words. The wagon rolled back toward the ridge with the children drowsy in the back, Wren already half asleep against August's shoulder. The afternoon light coming down through the scrub oak in long slanted columns the color of old honey. June watched the land, the way it swelled and dipped and recovered itself, and thought about the word home. Which was a word she'd stopped trusting at some point and wasn't sure yet whether to trust again. She thought about a man who had given her brother a silver dollar in Cimarron 11 years ago and then apparently spent 11 years keeping a distant, quiet accounting of whether things had gone well for her family. She thought about a door latch. Heavy iron. Thrown from the inside. She didn't say any of this. But she let her shoulder rest, very slightly, against the side of the wagon bench rather than holding herself forward and away from it. And she watched the ridge come closer through the late afternoon with something that was not yet peace but was, perhaps, its nearest available neighbor. Dix arrived in Harrow on a Friday and spent the day being careful about it. He was the kind of man who had learned that looking unremarkable was a skill worth cultivating, medium height, medium coloring, a coat that could belong to anyone. A manner of sitting at a bar that took up no more space than absolutely necessary. He had 2 whiskies over 3 hours, said little, and listened to a great deal. The barbershop yielded the property location. The saloon yielded Elias Cord's reputation, which was more substantial than Harcastle's letter had suggested. Mountain man. Good shot. Doesn't start things, but he finishes them decisively. Dix absorbed this without alarm. He had been in more dangerous situations. He rode out toward the ridge that evening, not going in, not yet, but reading the land the way experienced men read land, learning the approach angles, the sight lines. The places where a dog would hear you before a man would. There was a dog, he noted. A cattle dog of some kind, patrolling the south fence line with quiet dedication. He made camp 2 miles back in the scrub oak and waited for full dark before he moved. Elias slept light. He always had. It was a quality the mountains had refined in him over 20 years of living adjacent to the kind of country that did not distinguish between a man and a deer when it decided to test something. His body had learned to remain partly awake even when the rest of him was resting, a sentinel function that operated below consciousness and reported back. What woke him at midnight was not a sound exactly. It was the absence of a sound. The cattle dog, who normally made 1 pass along the south fence line with a low habitual sound every hour through the night, had gone quiet. Elias was on his feet before his mind had fully articulated why. He pulled on his boots and coat in darkness. He never lit a lamp when this happened. Because a lit lamp in a dark house was a declaration of position, and took the rifle from the pegs above the door with the quiet familiarity of a man who has performed this motion 10,000 times. And will perform it 10,000 more. He did not go out the front. He went through the back room, past the closed doors of the children's room, past June's door, which had its latch thrown and showed a thread of darkness at the gap, and out through the root cellar access that let him up alongside the barn in deep shadow. He stood against the barn wall and let his eyes adjust to the dark, which was considerable. Clouds had moved in from the northwest and killed most of the starlight. The yard was a series of shapes rather than objects, the well cover, the fence line, the bulk of the cartonwood at the property's east corner. Something moved near the cartonwood. Elias put the rifle to his shoulder and held it there, tracking. The shape resolved, a man, moving slow and low, working his way toward the house from the cartonwood side. He was good. He was quiet. But the ground between the cartonwood and the house crossed 12 feet of open yard, and Elias had chosen this property in part because of how the terrain read at night. He let the man cross to the edge of the shadow and stop. Then Elias said, from the dark, flat and conversational, there's a rifle on you right now that I shoot well enough at this distance not to worry about it. The shape went absolutely still. Put your hands out where the dark can see them, Elias said. After a moment, the hands came out. I've got no business with you, the man said. It was said carefully, without panic, which told Elias this was a professional and not a desperate man, which in its own way was worse, because professional men had employers. You're on my property at midnight, Elias said. That's business enough. I was sent to have a look. By Hardcastle. A pause. I'm not saying that. You don't have to. Elias moved to the edge of the barn shadow, keeping the distance between them manageable and unfavorable to the other man. You tell Hardcastle that the Beaumont situation has been resolved. The woman and the children are under my protection and on my property legally and permanently. His arrangement with Gerald Beaumont is dissolved. His claim on any part of that family is dissolved with it. The man was quiet. You also tell him, Elias said, that I'm aware he sent you, and I'm aware you came at night rather than by road, and I'm aware of what that means. And that I'm a man who keeps careful notes and has friends in the Federal Land Office in Denver and in the Circuit Court in Santa Fe. If Hardcastle has paper on Gerald Beaumont's debts that involves any claim on a person, that paper is something federal prosecutors are very interested in these days. He let that sit in the dark for a moment. Go back the way you came, Elias said. Leave the county. Tell Hardcastle what I said. The man went. Elias stood in the barn shadow for 10 minutes after the sound of hoofbeats had faded south, making sure, and then he went back through the root cellar and up into the house. June was standing in the kitchen doorway with a lamp in her hand, its flame turned low, wearing her coat over her nightdress. She had a cast iron skillet in her other hand, which she had clearly intended to use as a weapon and would have. He looked at the skillet. She looked at the rifle. They looked at each other. He's gone, Elias said. Hardcastle's man, she said. Not a question. Yes. She set the skillet down on the stovetop with a careful, deliberate motion. The flame in the lamp guttered in the draft from the door he'd come through and then steadied itself. Are the children awake? He said. No. Good. He leaned the rifle back against the wall and ran one hand over his face. Feeling the roughness of his beard and the particular tiredness that came not from labor but from sustained alertness. Go back to bed, June. It's handled for tonight. She stood for a moment, looking at him with those November eyes, reading something in his face that she didn't translate into words right away. Then she said, I'm not afraid of this. I know, he said. I want you to know that I understand what's coming and I'm not going to fall apart about it. I know that too, he said. And this time something moved in his voice that he didn't quite govern, something that had been waiting a long time to have occasion to come out. He caught it. Pressed it back. Said, more evenly, get some sleep. I'll keep watch. She went back down the hall. He heard the iron latch drop on her door, not anxiously, but deliberately, the way you close a door on a room you intend to return to. He sat down in the front room with the rifle across his knees and the lamp out and the fire low, and he kept watch until the sky outside the east window began to consider, with great reluctance, the possibility of morning. Elias rode into Harrow on a Monday with a letter he'd spent the better part of Sunday composing at the kitchen table. Which was unusual enough that June had brought him coffee twice and not commented on either delivery. The letter was addressed to a man named Fowler in Santa Fe, a federal land commissioner whom Elias had done a legitimate service for 8 years ago involving survey work in the Sangre de Cristos. And it outlined, in the plain and specific language of a man who had thought carefully about what he was saying, the nature of Rudd Hardcastle's debt operations and the specific arrangement that had been proposed regarding June Beaumont, who was a free citizen of the United States of America and not a transferable asset regardless of what her father had understood himself to be signing. He also stopped at Harlan Greaves's office. Greaves looked up from his desk with an expression that was attempting neutrality but not quite managing it. I want to file an addition to the property deed, Elias said, sitting down in the chair across from Greaves's desk without being invited to. I want June Beaumont's name added as a joint property holder. Greaves set his pen down. On what basis? On the basis that I have decided to offer marriage, Elias said, and that regardless of whether she accepts. I intend to ensure that she and those children have legal standing to remain on that property in perpetuity and cannot be removed from it by any arrangement or debt or judgment involving third parties. Greaves stared at him. I will also need the formal documentation, Elias continued, for the legal adoption of two minor children, August Beaumont, age 6, and Wren Beaumont, age 4, whose mother is deceased. The current custodial arrangements need to be regularized so that no claim from the maternal grandparents or any third party can be used to remove them. Cord, Greaves said. This is a considerable undertaking. Yes, Elias said. The community, Elias said with a patience that was the furthest thing from softness, will have whatever opinions it chooses to have. Those opinions will not affect what I file in this office today. Greaves looked at him for a long moment. Whatever he found in Elias's face, that granite, considered, absolute quality, was sufficient. He opened his record book. Elias drove home in the mid-afternoon with the filed documents in his inside coat pocket and a small paper bag from Mrs. Fitch's Mercantile in addition to the usual household goods. He unloaded the wagon, turned the horse into the paddock, and carried everything into the kitchen, where June was making something with dried apple and cinnamon that had turned the house into a place a person would want to come back to. He set the small paper bag on the table. She looked at it. What's that? Lemon drops, he said. August had a sore throat yesterday. That's what my mother always gave. June looked at the bag for a moment. Then she looked at him. He took the documents from his coat pocket and put them on the table as well. She wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the papers, reading them with the careful attention of a woman who had learned not to trust the surface of things. He watched her face as she read, the slight furrow, the stillness when she reached the adoption documents, the longer stillness when she reached the deed amendment. You filed these today, she said. Yes. Without asking me. I filed them for your legal protection, he said. Not for my own interest. You can refuse the marriage and the deed still stands. Those children have a home regardless of what you decide about anything else. She set the papers down. She looked out the window, where the late afternoon light was doing what it did best out here, taking an ordinary piece of country and making it seem, briefly and convincingly, like a place that mattered. You knew my family in Cimarron, she said. Yes. You remembered us for 11 years. Yes. Why, she said. Not accusing. Genuinely asking. Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at his own hands on the table, the knuckles, the scars, the evidence of 11 years of working country that did not apologize for itself. You were standing in a church doorway, he said, holding a hymnal. You had the look of a person who understood more than they were supposed to at that age and had decided to carry it without complaint. He paused. I thought about that for a long time. The dignity of it. He stopped. Collected himself. I wanted to know it had gone somewhere good for you. The kitchen held them both for a long moment. The dried apple and cinnamon worked in the air between them. Outside, Wren shrieked with laughter at something August had done in the yard, the specific shriek of a child who is utterly, comprehensively safe. Hardcastle, June said. Is it finished? The letter to Santa Fe will take care of the legal exposure. He's a man who depends on operating in shadow. Federal attention tends to dissolve that kind of man. He met her eyes. But I want your name on that deed. I want those children documented. Whatever else you decide. June looked at the adoption papers for a long moment. When she looked back up, something in her face had shifted, not broken open, not dissolved, but rearranged itself into a configuration that had more room in it than it had before. August talks about the horse, she said. I know. He talks about you, she said. In the way that children talk about things they're trying not to want too much. Elias said nothing. He waited. Ren calls this her house, June said. She's been calling it that since the third day. I corrected her once and then decided, she stopped. I decided it was accurate enough. It is accurate, he said. She picked up the lemon drops from the table and held the little bag in her hand, feeling the weight of the small, ordinary kindness of it. A man who remembered that a child had a sore throat. Who drove for days to find a family that had stayed in his mind for 11 years because they deserved better than what was coming for them. I won't be a woman who is grateful in a way that looks like obligation, she said clearly. If I accept, it's because I want to. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I know the difference, he said. I've been waiting for a different kind of answer. And if I need more time? I've been patient for 11 years, Elias said. I'm not going to run short of it now. Something that had been wound very tightly in June Beaumont for a very long time, through her sister's death and the twins' grief and her father's debt and the gathering dark of Hardcastle's interest, loosened itself by one careful, significant degree. She set the lemon drops down. She picked up the deed amendment. Get me a pen, she said. He did. She signed. The following Sunday, they drove into Harrow together, all four of them, and sat in the third row of the church and listened to a sermon about stewardship, which the preacher delivered with an eye toward Elias Cord and received back a gaze of such mild and complete serenity that he lost his place twice. Adela Fitch, sitting 2 rows forward, turned to look at the family unit assembled in the third row and found herself, despite extensive preparation for a more complicated reaction, simply moved in a way she didn't have vocabulary for. She turned back forward. She refolded her hands. In the pew beside her, her husband leaned in and whispered, "They look settled." "Yes," Mrs. Fitch agreed, after a moment. "They do." Harlan Greaves, across the aisle, found that his extensive opinions about standards and arrangements had, through some process he couldn't quite reconstruct, reorganized themselves into something considerably more modest. He nodded at Elias as they filed out after the service. Elias nodded back. Ren escaped June's hand the moment they reached the church steps and ran at the open air of the street with her arms out, coat flying, rabbit dangling from one hand, celebrating her own existence with a totality that only 4-year-olds and birds can manage. August walked beside Elias down the church steps with his hands in his coat pockets, watching Ren with the long-suffering fondness of an older sibling who would die before admitting he found her wonderful. "She's embarrassing," August said. "Yes," Elias agreed. "She does it all the time." "She'll always do it," Elias said. "Some people just run at things." August considered this. "Is that bad?" "No," Elias said. "It's brave, mostly. The world needs people who run at it." August was quiet for a moment, working this over. Then he looked up at Elias with the directness that only a child can manage without apology. "Are we going to stay?" Elias looked at June, who was coming down the steps behind them with her hand on the railing and the Sunday light on her face, that hard, high country light that didn't flatter anyone and yet managed, in this moment, to make everything it touched look permanent and true. She caught his eye. She didn't look away. "Yes," Elias said, to August, but also to the broader question that the morning had put to him. "We're going to stay." The letter to Santa Fe did its work within the month. Rudd Hardcastle found himself the subject of a federal inquiry into his lending practices, which had, as Elias had correctly suspected, involved arrangements about people as collateral that the law found unacceptable. His operation in Taos was dismantled by spring. Dix took employment elsewhere. Joel Beaumont, to his limited credit, sent a letter in December that was approximately half apology and half self-justification, which June read once, folded, and placed in the kindling box without ceremony. The adoption was finalized in February. The circuit judge came to Harrow for 3 days of hearings and spent the middle day at Elias's property, inspecting the premises, speaking with the neighbors, who had, by that point, reorganized their opinions considerably, and concluding that August and Wren Beaumont were resident in a household of demonstrable stability, care, and genuine intention. The judge signed the documents at the kitchen table. June made coffee and cornbread. The judge, a widower out of Pueblo who had seen considerable human misery in his 20 years on the circuit, ate 2 pieces of cornbread and said it was the best he'd had in the territory. That's not saying a great deal, August informed him seriously. Elias's mouth did something that was not quite a smile but was very close to one. June, at the stove, did not turn around. But her shoulders changed their shape, loosened, settled, let something go that had been held for a long time. The latch on her door remained, installed and functional. She had not thrown it in 6 weeks. There is a particular kind of strength that does not announce itself. It does not arrive on horseback with its reputation preceding it. It does not stand in doorways making speeches about what it intends to do. It works in the dark, before the house is awake. It fills the firewood box so that someone else doesn't have to go out in the cold. It drives for days because a thought it had 11 years ago has never, in all that time, resolved itself into indifference. The San Juan Mountains do not remember the names of the people who have lived and struggled and recovered in their shadow. The wind off the high country does not distinguish between the sound of a door closing on grief and a door opening on something new. The land keeps no record of the specific moment when a woman who had stopped trusting the word home allowed herself, quietly and without fanfare, to use it again. But the things we build in that silence, the meals made from what's left, the children tended with borrowed strength, the small and stubborn acts of choosing decency over convenience, those things accumulate. They lay themselves down like river stones, one on top of the other, until what was broken becomes instead a foundation. And the broken places, tended honestly, grow back stronger than before. Not unmarked. Not without scar. But strong. And warm. And, at long last, home.